John Carter woke up at 5 in the morning, like he had done every day for the past 15 years, and walked to his kitchen window to check the weather and his cornfields, stretched out beyond the old red barn that his father had built in 1985. And the September morning looked perfect for harvesting with clear skies, and no wind to speak of, and he could see the golden corn stalks swaying gently in the distance. Waiting for him to bring them in, Mary was still sleeping upstairs, and the kids. Danny and Lisa would not wake up for another hour, so John made his coffee in silence and stepped out onto the front porch to breathe in the crisp Nebraska air that smelled like earth and growing things and home. And he had no idea that this would be the last normal morning of his life, or that in 6 hours everything he had ever known would be gone forever. First sign that something was wrong came at exactly 11:15, when every electronic device in the house started making noise. At the same time, and John heard the television turn on by itself in the living room, and his phone began buzzing in his pocket, and even the old radio in the barn started crackling with static and voices speaking in languages he had never heard. Before John ran inside to find Mary standing in front of the television with her hand over her mouth, and Danny and Lisa huddled behind her looking scared and confused, and on the screen was something that John's mind could not process at first, because it looked like a man, but taller and thinner, with skin that seemed to be made of crystal or glass, and eyes that glowed with blue light. Creature on the screen spoke in perfect English, but its voice sounded like thunder rolling across. The planes in it said that its name was Commander Vexhai of the Zelithan Empire, and that Earth had been selected for immediate agricultural conversion, and that all human inhabitants of farming regions had 24 hours to evacuate before terraforming operations would begin. John felt the coffee mug slip from his hand and shatter on the kitchen floor as Commander Vexhai explained that Earth's soil composition was perfect for restoring their dying homeworld, and that resistance would be futile because their technology was thousands of years ahead of anything humans had developed, and that anyone who remained in agricultural zones after the deadline would be removed by force. Mary grabbed John's arm and asked him what they should do and where they could go, but John could not answer because he was staring out the window at the horizon where massive black shapes were descending from the sky, like storm clouds made of metal and glass, and he realized that the aliens were not giving them 24 hours out of kindness, but because they needed time to position their ships. The first harvester landed in John's north field at exactly noon, and it was the size of a football stadium and made no sound as it touched down among his corn stalks, and John watched in horror as mechanical arms extended from its hull and began tearing up his crops, row by row with surgical precision and efficiency that made his heart break. John ran outside toward the machine, even though Mary was screaming at him to come back, and he made it about 50 yards before an invisible wall of energy stopped him cold and sent him flying backward into the dirt, with his hands burned and smoking, and the smell of his own flesh filling his nostrils. More ships were landing now in every direction, and John could see them stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see, and each one was destroying farmland that had been worked by families for generations and turning fertile fields into scarred earth that looked like the surface of an alien moon. The harvester in his field was working faster now, and John watched 15 years of his life disappear in minutes as the machine stripped away topsoil that had taken decades to build up, and the corn that should have fed his family through the winter was being processed into some kind of nutrient paste that flowed through tubes into the ship's storage compartments. By evening, the machine had moved to his south field and was working on the soybeans that he had planted in the spring when Lisa was learning to ride her bicycle, and Danny was helping him fix the irrigation system, and John realized that his children would never see their home the way it had been, and would never understand what it meant to work land that belonged to your family. Military helicopters flew overhead throughout the day, but they did not attack the alien ships, and John learned later that every government on Earth had surrendered within hours of the initial contact, because the aliens had demonstrated their power by destroying a military base in Nevada with a single shot from orbit. That night, John and his family packed what they could carry into their pickup truck and joined the stream of refugees heading east toward the cities, and John looked back once at his farm to see the alien facility rising from the ruins of his cornfield like a cancer growing from the Earth itself. The harvester worked through the night with lights that turned the darkness into day, and John knew that by morning there would be nothing left of the life he had built except memories and the bitter taste of defeat, and the knowledge that somewhere among the stars a dying alien world would leave again because his home had been murdered. As they drove away, John made a promise to himself and to his children and to the land that had raised him that this was not the end, but the beginning, and that somehow he would find a way to take back what had been stolen, even if it killed him trying. The refugee camp outside Kansas City was a nightmare of mud and desperation that stretched for miles in every direction, with thousands of displaced families living in tents and abandoned warehouses and old shipping containers that had been converted into temporary shelters, and John Carter had never seen so much human misery in one place before. Mary and the children slept on cots in a converted gymnasium with 40 other families, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear and hopelessness. And every night Lisa cried herself to sleep, asking when they could go home, and every night John had to tell her that he did not know the government food trucks came twice a day with processed meals that tasted like cardboard, and water that had been treated with so many chemicals that it burned going down, and John watched his children get thinner and paler as the weeks passed, and he felt like a failure as a father and as a man for not being able to protect them. But John was not the only one who refused to accept defeat, and he began to notice other men and women in the camp who carried themselves differently than the broken refugees around them, and who looked at the alien ships flying overhead with anger instead of fear, and who talked in quiet voices about fighting back instead of just surviving. Pete Rodriguez was a cattle rancher from Texas who had lost 4,000 acres of grazing land and 3 generations of prize bulls to the alien harvesters. And he walked through the camp each evening, talking to anyone who would listen about organizing resistance against the occupying forces. Helen Brooks had been a wheat farmer in Montana before the invasion, and she knew more about machinery and electronics than most engineers, and she spent her days studying photographs of alien equipment that refugees had smuggled out of the terraforming zones and trying to understand how their technology worked. Frank Collins was different from the farmers because he had been a Marine before he came home to Nebraska to work as a crop pilot, and he knew about weapons and tactics and how to move through hostile territory without being detected, and he drew maps of alien patrol routes on scraps of cardboard. With a broken pencil, the 4 of them met for the first time in an abandoned grain silo outside the camp on a cold October night, and John felt something he had not felt since losing his farm, and that was hope mixed with the possibility of revenge against the creatures who had stolen his life. Pete spoke first and said that scattered resistance groups were forming all across the Midwest, but they needed coordination and leadership and supplies if they were going to be more than just angry farmers throwing rocks at alien machines. Helen had been monitoring alien communications frequencies with a radio she had built from spare parts, and she reported that the terraforming operation was ahead of schedule, and that within 2 years the aliens would strip mine every acre of agricultural land in North America. Frank had been in contact with other military veterans in the refugee camps, and he said that many of them were ready to fight, but they needed a plan that was better than suicide attacks against superior technology. Listened to them talk and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat, because he realized that these people were looking to him for answers, even though he was just a farmer who had never led anything more complicated than a church committee meeting. But John also understood the land better than any of them, and he knew every back road and hidden valley and abandoned farm building in 3 counties, and he realized that this knowledge could be turned into a weapon against invaders who had never set foot on Earth soil before their ships arrived. They agreed to meet again the following week and to bring anyone else they could trust, and John spent the next 7 days walking through the refugee camp and talking to displaced farmers and ranchers, and looking for the spark of defiance in their eyes that separated the fighters from the defeated. The second meeting was held in an empty barn 20 miles from the camp, and 12 people showed up, including a grain elevator operator named Carl Murphy, and a veterinarian named Susan Walsh, and a farm equipment dealer named Bob Harrison, who had access to trucks and tools and fuel. John stood in front of the group and spoke about his farm and his children, and the alien machine that had destroyed everything he had ever worked for, and he saw his own anger reflected in their faces and knew that he had found his army. They called themselves the Terra Liberation Front, and they made their first strike 3 weeks later when Frank Collins led a team that destroyed an alien supply convoy using improvised explosives made from fertilizer and diesel fuel. Attack was small and did minimal damage, but it proved that the aliens could be hurt, and that human determination could overcome superior technology if applied in the right way at the right time. More people joined them after word of the convoy attack spread through the refugee camps, and John found himself commanding a force of over 200 fighters within 2 months, and they operated out of abandoned farm buildings and moved through irrigation tunnels and communicated using modified farming equipment. Radios. The aliens responded to the resistance with increased patrols and energy barriers around their facilities, but they underestimated human knowledge of the terrain and the willingness of desperate people to take enormous risks for the chance of getting their lives back. John learned to think like a general instead of a farmer, and he studied alien patrol patterns and supply routes and communication frequencies, and he began to understand that the invaders had weaknesses that could be exploited by people who knew the land better than any off-world species ever could. By winter, the Terra Liberation Front was conducting hit-and-run attacks across 5 states, and John Carter had become someone he never thought he could be, which was a leader of men in a war for the survival of his species and the liberation of his home. The alien scout ship crashed in a cornfield 5 miles from what used to be John's farm on a foggy morning in January, and Frank Collins saw it go down while he was conducting reconnaissance from an old water tower, and he radioed John immediately to report that they had their first real chance to capture alien technology. John assembled his best team within an hour, and they moved through the frozen fields, using irrigation ditches for cover, while alien search parties flew overhead in their ray sleek aircraft looking for the missing scout ship and its crew. The crash site was a mess of twisted metal and crystalline debris scattered across 2 acres of stubble, and John could see that the ship had hit the ground hard enough to break through its energy shields and crack the hull like an eggshell. 2 alien bodies lay in the wreckage, and they looked even stranger up close than they did on television broadcasts, with their translucent skin and elongated limbs and faces that seemed to be carved from living glass. Helen Brooks was with them, and she immediately began examining the ship's control systems, while Frank and Pete Rodriguez secured the perimeter and watched for alien rescue teams that would certainly come looking for their missing scout. The alien computer was still partially functional despite the crash, and Helen connected her portable equipment to what looked like the main data port and began downloading files as fast as her improvised system could handle the alien information. John stood guard while Helen worked, and he felt a mixture of excitement and fear, because this was their first real chance to learn something useful about their enemies, but also because alien reinforcements could arrive at any moment. After 2 hours of work, Helen announced that she had extracted several terabytes of data from the ship's memory banks, and that they needed to leave immediately because her equipment was detecting incoming aircraft on the horizon. They destroyed the crash site with explosives to prevent the aliens from recovering anything useful, and then retreated to an abandoned grain elevator where Helen could analyze what they had found in safety. What Helen discovered over the next 3 days changed everything John thought he knew about the alien invasion, and made him realize that Earth's situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. The data revealed that the Zelethans were not colonizing Earth, but strip mining it for biological resources to synthesize artificial soil for their dying homeworld, and that the terraforming process would leave Earth completely barren within 5 years even. More disturbing was the evidence that 17 other inhabited worlds had already been subjected to the same treatment, and that each one had been left as a lifeless husk when the aliens moved on to their next target. John stared at the translated documents that Helen showed him and felt sick as he read descriptions of worlds where billions of intelligent beings had lived and worked and raised families before being evacuated to die in refugee camps, while their planets were stripped bare. But the most important discovery was hidden in the technical specifications for the terraforming equipment, and Helen spent hours explaining to John how the alien machines relied on a specific frequency resonance to maintain their energy shields and processing systems. Frequency was tied to the magnetic field of the Zelethan homeworld, and it was hard-coded into every piece of their technology, which meant that disrupting it would cause cascading failures. Throughout their entire operation, Helen calculated that they could build a resonance disruptor using parts from human electronics, combined with alien components salvaged from the crash site, but it would have to be planted directly in the central control facility to be effective. John realized with a cold certainty that the central facility was located on the exact spot where his farmhouse had stood, and where his children had played in the yard, and where 3 generations of his family had worked the soil. The irony was almost too much to bear, but John understood that fate had brought him full circle, and that his personal war against the aliens would end where it had begun. Helen also discovered that the terraforming network was controlled from 12 primary sites across North America, and that all of them would have to be hit simultaneously to prevent the aliens from rerouting their operations. John studied the maps and facility layouts that Helen had extracted from the alien computer, and began planning the most ambitious operation in the history of human resistance against the occupation they would need to coordinate with resistance cells in 11 other states and time their attacks to occur within minutes of each other and somehow penetrate the most heavily defended alien installations on the continent. The technical challenge was enormous, but John had learned that human determination could overcome almost any obstacle if properly applied, and he knew that this was their only chance to save not just Earth, but all the other worlds that would be targeted after the aliens finished strip mining. His planet, Pete Rodriguez volunteered to lead the assault on the Texas facility, and Frank Collins said he could steal an alien transport to get John's team inside the Nebraska complex using forged identification codes from the captured data. Helen Brooks would take responsibility for the Montana operation and coordinate the timing with resistance leaders in the other target states using encrypted communications equipment that she built from salvaged alien technology. John spent the next week studying every detail of the central facility and memorizing guard rotations and security protocols, and he realized that success would require not just courage, but also the kind of intimate knowledge of the terrain that only came from a lifetime of working the land. As he prepared for what might be his final mission, John thought about Mary and Danny and Lisa in their refugee camp, and about the farm that had been stolen from his family, and about all the other worlds that had died so that an alien species could extend its own life. The weight of responsibility was crushing. But John had learned that ordinary people could become extraordinary when everything they loved was threatened, and that a farmer's knowledge of his land could be turned into a weapon more powerful than any alien technology. The mission would launch in 7 days, and John Carter would either save his world or die trying. But either way, he would face the aliens as what he had always been, which was a man who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. John Carter spread the stolen alien maps across the table in the abandoned grain elevator and looked at the fortress that had been built on top of his family farm, and felt anger burn in his chest like a coal fire that would never go out. The central facility covered 2 square miles and was protected by energy barriers and automated defense systems and patrols of alien guards who carried weapons that could vaporize a human being in seconds. Helen Brooks had spent 3 weeks building resonance disruptors from components salvaged from the crashed scout ship, and she had created 12 identical devices that looked like metal boxes, covered with crystalline circuits and blinking lights. Each disruptor had to be planted in the main control room of its target facility and activated simultaneously with the others, or the aliens would have time to adapt their frequencies and render the weapons useless. Frank Collins had been studying the flight patterns of alien transports and had identified a supply run that occurred every Tuesday morning at exactly 7:30, and he believed he could intercept one of the ships and steal it. Without triggering security alert speed, Rodriguez had made contact with resistance leaders in Texas and Montana and California and 8 other states, and they were all preparing strike teams to hit their assigned targets on the same day. The plan was ambitious beyond anything the Terra Liberation Front had ever attempted, and John knew that most of them would probably die, but he also knew that this was their only chance to save Earth from the same fate that had befallen 17 other worlds. John assigned his best fighters to the mission team, including Carl Murphy, who knew explosives, and Susan Walsh, who could treat injuries, and Bob Harrison, who understood machinery better than anyone except Helen. They spent 2 weeks practicing the infiltration in a mock-up facility that they built inside an abandoned aircraft hangar using measurements and photographs from the alien data files. Every detail had to be perfect, because they would only get one chance, and any mistake would result in death or capture and the failure of the entire operation. John found himself thinking constantly about Mary and Danny and Lisa in the refugee camp in Colorado, where he had sent them for their safety, and he wondered if he would ever see them again. Mary had begged him to come with them and to abandon the resistance and focus on keeping their family alive. But John could not explain to her that there would be no future for their children if the aliens succeeded in their plans. The night before the mission, John walked through the ruins of his farmhouse and stood in what used to be his kitchen and remembered the morning when everything changed and his family's life was destroyed. He could see the alien facility rising from his former cornfield, like a cancer made of metal and crystal, and he made a promise to his father's memory and to the soil that had nurtured his family for generations. Frank Collins had successfully captured an alien transport 3 days earlier, and Helen had modified its identification codes using data from the crashed scout ship and programmed it to respond to human voice commands. The transport looked like a silver teardrop, the size of a school bus, and it flew without making any sound and could carry 12 people at speeds that made John's stomach churn. John's team would approach the facility just before dawn, when alien activity was at its lowest, and Frank would drop them at the main entrance using stolen security codes to get past the automated defenses. Meanwhile, Pete Rodriguez would be leading his team against the Texas facility, and Helen Brooks would be coordinating simultaneous strikes at 10 other locations across the continent. Timing had to be exact, because the aliens would detect the first attack within minutes and begin implementing countermeasures that could prevent the other teams from succeeding. John had studied the layout of the central facility, until he could navigate it blindfolded. And he knew that the main control room was located in the central tower, exactly where his farmhouse kitchen used to be. Symbolism was not lost on him that he would be planting humanity's salvation in the same spot, where he had once made coffee and watched the sunrise over his cornfields, had calculated that they would have approximately 15 minutes to reach the control room and plant the disruptor before alien security forces could respond in overwhelming numbers. John's team would have to fight their way through corridors filled with alien technology and guards while carrying the resonance disruptor, which was too delicate to survive rough-handling Carl Murphy, would handle the explosives needed to breach internal barriers, and Susan Walsh would treat any wounded team members, and Bob Harrison would help Helen interface the disruptor. With alien control systems, Frank Collins would maintain the transport at a safe distance and attempt to extract the team after the mission was completed. But John knew that extraction was unlikely given the level of security they would face. Other resistance leaders had agreed to begin their attacks at exactly 6:30 in the morning, and John's team would activate their disruptor at 6:45 to allow time for the other strikes to create confusion. John spent his final evening writing letters to Mary and Danny and Lisa that he hoped they would never have to read, and thinking about the farm that had made him who he was. He remembered teaching Danny how to plant corn and helping Lisa catch fireflies in the summer evenings, and working beside Mary during harvest season when the whole world seemed golden and perfect. Those memories gave him strength for what was coming, because he knew that everything worth protecting was worth dying for, and that some fights could not be won by reasonable people who played by civilized rules. The transport would launch at 4 in the morning, and John would either save his world or die. But either way, he would face the aliens on ground that belonged to his family and his people. As he prepared his weapons and equipment, John thought about all the farmers and ranchers who had joined the resistance, and about the refugee camps full of displaced families, and about the children who deserved to inherit a world that had not been murdered by alien strip miners. Tomorrow would bring either liberation or death, but tonight John Carter was still a farmer who understood that some harvests required the ultimate sacrifice, and some seeds could only be planted with blood. The alien transport moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost, and John Carter watched his former farmland pass below and saw the massive facility that had grown from the grave of his cornfield. Like some mechanical cancer feeding on the corpse of his dreams, Frank Collins piloted the stolen ship with steady hands while John's strike team checked their weapons and equipment one final time, and each man knew that this would probably be their last mission, but none of them spoke about death or failure. Helen Brooks monitored communications from the other resistance cells and reported that Pete Rodriguez was in position outside the Texas facility, and that strike teams in 10 other states were ready to begin their attacks in exactly 17 minutes. John looked at the resonance disruptor sitting beside him and thought about the alien scout ship that had crashed in a cornfield, and the data that Helen had extracted from its computers, and the terrible knowledge of 17 dead worlds that drove them forward. The central facility grew larger as they approached, and John could see the towers and processing plants and energy barriers that surrounded the complex, where his family home had once stood and where his children had played in the yard. Frank activated the stolen security codes that Helen had programmed into the transport, and the alien automated defenses recognized them as friendly and allowed the ship to pass through the outer perimeter without challenge. They landed at a maintenance dock on the eastern side of the facility, and John led his team out into the cold morning air that smelled like ozone and processed chemicals. Instead of earth and growing things, the facility was a maze of corridors and chambers filled with alien technology that hummed with power, and John followed the route he had memorized from the stolen data files while his team moved behind him in tactical formation. They encountered their first alien guard at the main junction, and Carl Murphy took him down with a silenced rifle before the creature could sound an alarm, and they hid the body in a storage closet and continued deeper into the complex Johns. Radio crackled with reports from the other resistance cells as they began their attacks right on schedule, and he heard explosions and weapons fire from facilities across the continent as humanity struck back against the occupying forces. The aliens were responding quickly to the coordinated assault, and John could hear alarm systems activating throughout the central facility as security forces mobilized to deal with the unexpected threat. His team moved faster now because stealth was no longer possible, and they fought their way through corridors that pulsed with alien energy while carrying the delicate resonance disruptor toward the central control tower. Bob Harrison took a plasma bolt in the shoulder, and Susan Walsh bandaged the wound while John and Frank Collins held off a squad of alien guards with automatic weapons that seemed pathetically primitive compared to enemy technology. They reached the base of the central tower with 8 minutes to spare, and John looked up at the structure that rose from the exact spot where his kitchen table had once sat and where his family had shared breakfast on the last normal morning of their lives. Elevator to the control room was guarded by 2 alien sentries, and John's team eliminated them with grenades and small arms fire before the creatures could call for reinforcements. The control room was a vast chamber filled with holographic displays and crystalline control panels that showed the progress of terraforming operations across North America. And John felt sick as he watched Earth's biosphere being systematically destroyed. Commander Vex High was waiting for them with a squad of elite guards who carried weapons that crackled with energy, and the alien leader looked at John with curiosity rather than fear or anger. The commander spoke in that voice like distant thunder and said that he had been monitoring John's activities since the resistance began, and that he was impressed by the resourcefulness of a simple agricultural worker. John placed the resonance disruptor on the main control console while his team fought the alien guards, and he looked Commander Vex High in the eyes and said that this was his land and that the aliens had no right to be. Herr Vex High explained that Earth was just one of many worlds that would be harvested to save this Alethan homeworld, and that human sacrifice was necessary for the greater good of a superior species. John activated the resonance disruptor, while Frank Collins and Carl Murphy held the doorway against reinforcements, and the device began emitting the frequency that Helen had calculated would disrupt alien technology. The effect was immediate and devastating as control panels throughout the facility began exploding in showers of sparks, and the energy barriers that protected the complex started flickering and failing. John felt the building shake as the terraforming machinery began shutting down, and he heard explosions from other parts of the facility as alien systems overloaded and destroyed themselves. Commander Vex High raised his weapon to kill John, but the plasma rifle failed to fire as the disrupted frequency spread through the facility's power grid and caused cascading failures in all alien technology. Frank Collins shot the alien commander with his human rifle, and Vex High fell to the floor with surprise in his glowing eyes, because he had never imagined that primitive projectile weapons could harm a superior being. The team fought their way back to the transport as the facility collapsed around them, and alien aircraft fell from the sky like broken toys as the frequency disruption spread through their networked systems. Helen Brooks reported over the radio that similar failures were occurring at alien installations across the continent as the other resistance teams activated their disruptors and brought down the entire terraforming network. John's transport barely escaped the collapsing facility, and Frank Collins flew them to safety, while behind them the central complex burned with fires that turned the night sky orange and red as they flew away from the ruins. John looked down at the scarred earth where his farm had been and felt a mixture of grief and satisfaction, because his family land had been avenged even though it could never be restored. The mission had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes, and the alien occupation of Earth was collapsing as their technology failed, and their ships crashed, and their grand plan to strip mine another world crumbled into. Thus John Carter had started the day as a resistance fighter and ended it as the man who had saved his planet, but all he really wanted was to go home to his family and tell them that the nightmare was finally over. The Zelithan ships fell from the sky like autumn leaves for 3 days after the resonance disruptors activated, and John Carter stood in the ruins of his farm watching alien technology burn while human rescue teams pulled survivors from the wreckage commander. Vex High had died in the central facility, but other alien leaders survived the collapse of their invasion, and they requested negotiations through radio broadcasts that reached every human settlement on Earth. John found himself appointed as humanity's representative in the talks because his successful mission had made him famous throughout the refugee camps, and his name was being spoken alongside the greatest military leaders in human history. Negotiations took place in a neutral zone outside. Denver and John sat across from the surviving Zelithan commanders and listened to them explain that their homeworld was dying and that they had strip-mined 17 other planets to try to save their civilization. The aliens offered to share their advanced technology in exchange for a negotiated settlement that would allow them to continue terraforming operations in uninhabited regions of Earth, but John rejected their proposal. Immediately, John told the aliens that Earth belonged to humanity, and that no deal would be acceptable that involved the destruction of any part of his planet, and that they could either help restore what they had damaged or face continued resistance. Zelithans were in no position to make demands because their technology was useless without the frequency resonance that tied it to their homeworld, and human engineers, led by Helen Brooks, were already reverse engineering their equipment. Pete Rodriguez had survived the Texas mission, and he joined John at the negotiating table along with representatives from the other resistance cells, and together they demanded full reparations for the damage caused by the invasion. The final agreement required the aliens to restore Earth's stolen soil using their terraforming technology, but in reverse, and to provide humanity with advanced agricultural techniques that could produce food more efficiently than ever before. Zelithans also shared data about other threatened worlds in the galaxy and agreed to help establish human colonies that could serve as refuges for species facing extinction from strip mining operations. John returned to his farm 6 months after the invasion ended and found it scarred but not destroyed because the alien machines had only removed the topsoil, and the deeper earth remained fertile and ready for planting. Mary and Danny and Lissa came home from the refugee camp in Colorado, and together they began the long work of restoration using both human determination and alien technology to rebuild what had been lost. Danny was 11 now, and Lisa was 9, and they helped their father plant the first new crops in soil that had been enriched by alien science and would produce harvests beyond anything previous generations had imagined. The Terra Liberation Front evolved into Earth's first interplanetary defense organization, with John serving as its civilian commander, but he insisted on spending half his time working the land that had made him who he was. Helen Brooks established a research center on the site of the former central facility, and she worked with alien scientists to develop terraforming techniques that could restore dead worlds. Instead of creating them, Frank Collins became the first human to pilot an alien spacecraft to another star system, and he led rescue missions to evacuate populations from planets targeted by other strip mining operations. Pete Rodriguez used alien technology to restore the grasslands of Texas, and his cattle grazed on pastures that were more productive than anything his grandfather could have dreamed of. The refugee camps were closed within 2 years as displaced families returned to restored farmland, and cities were rebuilt using construction techniques that combined human ingenuity with alien materials. John's farm became a symbol of human Resilience and visitors came from around the world to see the place, where a simple farmer had started the resistance that saved Earth from becoming another dead world. But John remained humble about his role in the victory, because he knew that the real heroes were the thousands of farmers and ranchers who had refused to accept defeat and had fought back against impossible odds the first harvest after. The restoration was the best in living memory, and John stood in his cornfield with his family and watched the golden stalks sway in the Nebraska wind while alien ships flew overhead carrying supplies to refugee worlds. Danny asked his father if the bad aliens would ever come back, and John told him that Earth was protected now by both human determination and alien allies who had learned that cooperation was better than conquest. Lisa wanted to know if other children on other worlds would be safe from the strip miners, and John promised her that Earth's new defense force would make sure that no planet would suffer the fate of the 17 dead worlds. That evening, John sat on his front porch with Mary and watched the sunset paint the sky above his restored fields, and he thought about the morning when everything had changed and the long journey that had brought them home. The alien invasion had lasted only 6 months, but it had transformed humanity from a single world species into a galactic civilization dedicated to protecting life throughout the universe. John Carter had started as a farmer defending his land and had become a leader in humanity's expansion to the stars. But his heart remained rooted in the Nebraska soil that his family had worked for generations. The harvest was good that year, and every year after, because the fusion of human knowledge and alien technology had created agricultural techniques that could feed entire worlds without damaging the environment. Children grew up hearing stories about the farmer who had saved Earth, and John's name was remembered alongside the greatest heroes in human history. But he never forgot that his real victory was bringing his family home. As the years passed, John watched his children grow into adults who understood both the value of hard work and the importance of protecting other species from those who would exploit them. The galaxy was a safer place because a farmer had refused to let aliens steal his land and had fought back with the stubborn determination that comes from working soil that belongs to your family. John Carter lived to see humanity establish colonies on 100 worlds, and to know that the Zelith and strip mining operations had been shut down forever, and that no world would die to save another. The end, the aliens had learned that taking a farmer's land was easy, but taking the farmer out of the fight was impossible, and that human beings would go to any lengths to protect the places they called home.